Hi, this is Kathy Hanfel, and this is Anxiety-Free Solutions for Social Media World, Legal and Ethical Issues for Therapists. And this video is focusing on telehealth. So, for those of you who have been in practice a while, many of us jumped into this rather quickly and abruptly, and maybe not in the most thoughtful way that we would have liked because of the pandemic and the shelter-in-place orders. So this is just an overview of the things you need to be thinking about in California, the rules, the regulations, the ethical codes, in order to be doing this in the best way possible for you and your clients. This is much better as a GIF, but this is kind of how many of us felt when we were starting telehealth very quickly. I myself will admit that I had set things up like a day or two before things were, the shelter in place, the order actually happened, and I had picked out a provider, and on the very first day they crashed, and I spent the first day looking for another provider. So now we don't have to deal with at least those things too much. So the first thing about telehealth is making sure you have a HIPAA compliant platform that gives you a business associate agreement that we talked about in the HIPAA section. So the former president had a waiver saying you didn't need the HIPAA compliant platform, but in general, it's considered best practice to have it, and that rule will be enforced again at some point. And now that we're in it and, there are more resources, there's really no reason not to be using a HIPAA-compliant platform. You may want to read the privacy policies of any company you choose to work with. Some companies collect a lot of information. I think as we do more and more things online, we're learning more and more about what free services actually mean, which usually means they're getting a great deal of information from you. And while there might be some variance from state to state, it's generally not considered okay to practice telehealth with a client who's located in a place where you're not licensed. And in California, where the client is where the therapy is. So you can be out of state, but they can't be out of state. And the ethical codes and regulations don't flesh out like temporarily leaving the state. So technically, if you're seeing someone out of state or even out of the country, you are violating the law. Now, California law fleshes it out more as far as saying like you have to follow the rules in the state or country that the client is in. So if the client is in, say, a country that doesn't have any rules, then you should be okay. I would always call the camp lawyers and check it out, but that should be okay. And during this COVID time, many states have some waivers. I have a temporary waiver for one other state where a client moved. That's good for as long as the emergency declaration is in effect. And just double checking with your malpractice provider that they cover telehealth. When I asked mine, which is CPH, they basically said as long as you're following the rules. So the California codes, I'm not going to read them word for word because you have the slides, you can read them yourself. This just sort of reiterates that you must have a license, you must follow the same rules, you're applicable to the same rules and regulations as therapy in person. There's a list of things you need to do when you start telehealth practice, including informed consent, which I'll talk about what needs to be in that later, and letting the client know the risks and benefits of treatment, making sure they have your license number, and document reasonable efforts, trying to find an emergency contact for a client and emergency services wherever they're located. Each time you meet with a client, you're supposed to verify verbally their location and full name and assess whether they're appropriate for telehealth, because there are some clients who might not be appropriate for telehealth, and utilize best practices for telehealth, which is mostly using a HIPAA compliant platform. This is what I said before about the other jurisdictions, and failure to comply is considered unprofessional conduct. The CAFT code has a section on telehealth, and it basically reiterates the stuff that's in the law. So again, I'm not going to read it to you. You can read it yourself. And making sure you let them know the risks and that you're complying with all laws. And yeah. So what does this all mean in plain language? So you need a informed consent, and I would get it in writing. You can have a separate informed consent for telehealth or integrate it into your regular informed consent. The client must have access to your license or registration number. You have to have your reasonable efforts to ascertain the contact information of relevant resources in the geographic area. I put this in my consent. I have them give me an emergency contact person, preferably local, so that if something happens, we get disconnected, I feel, weird and I can't get in touch with the client, I have somebody else to call. And also where the nearest hospital is. None of this has to be written, but as we all know, if it's not in writing, there's no proof that it happened. If you get it verbally, you definitely need to document it in the file that that's how you did it. When you're doing telehealth, it's best practice to get a copy of the client's driver's license, especially if you've never met them before, so you're verifying the state where they live and their age. Okay, so what needs to be in your consent, your telehealth consent? So you need to state clearly that if the client chooses not to do telehealth, that's okay. There's no consequences to that. You need to let them know any potential risks or consequences of telemedicine. You need to let them know that all existing confidentiality protections apply to telehealth. The same with any records, access to records and copies of medical information. Those all exist in the same manner. That you're not going to disseminate patient identifiable images, which would be a huge ethical breach. So you would never do that, but it needs to be in your consent that you're not going to do that. And then each telehealth sentence, verbally obtain and document the client's name and address at time of session. I just write a little quick note when I'm doing my notes. Client was at home during session, client was at work, client was in a car at the park at the corner of this street and this street, just so there's a record that I have been consistently documenting that information. And obviously, if they're not appropriate for telehealth, then you would want to make a note of that and what your plan was. And, using best practices, which is your HIPAA compliant platform. So again, other states, you're only allowed to do it if it's permitted in that state, and you're usually going to go to your licensing board, and strangely enough, sometimes it can be different between licenses, like the rule for the MFT may not be the same as the rule for the LCSW. But in general terms, it's not recommended to do it. It can be out of your outside of your scope of practice, and if there's a liability issue, your insurance could get wobbly around it. This is just one of the thoughtful questions I throw in here, and just have you been practicing out of state or out of country? How has that been for you? Why did you make the decision to do it or not do it? And this is a good link for resources. Person-Centered Tech is just a massive, great resource for all things tech. The shrink space I found really helpful for information about other states, although I recommended it to somebody else and they found it not helpful. So I guess it depends on you and your needs. Your tips for good interactions, confidential space, both for you and for the client, and sometimes that's been a real issue for clients during shelter in place. Using headphones for confidentiality, so somebody can't hear the other voice. It can also reduce feedback. Making sure you have good technology. A bigger screen is better. You need a strong internet connection. They need a strong internet connection. Wired connections are considered best, but if you're using Wi-Fi, just make sure you have the best Wi-Fi plan that there is, especially if somebody else in the house is using the Wi-Fi at the same time as you. A well-lit space. I actually have a little ring light on top of my computer for these times when I close the curtains because the sun is beaming down on my face. Closing out other programs because they can take up data and make your Wi-Fi connection wobbly, and making sure you're on a secure network. So you need to be on your own network with your own password that you know. You can't be doing this at Starbucks on the public Wi-Fi. And the client really shouldn't be either. Does insurance companies do insurance companies cover telehealth? Yes, in California, it's one of 21 states, along with the District of Columbia, where it is required. Um, you know, Insurance companies can always be a little wobbly, and so it's always best to double check it. And sometimes pretty often they'll cover video sessions, but a lot of them don't cover phone sessions. Although that's been, I think, really loosened up during the pandemic. Different platforms. So these are a bunch of different platforms. Zoom, you don't actually, sorry, the slide isn't updated. You don't have to use the healthcare option now. You can get the regular business plan for $14.95 a month, and they will give you a BAA. You have to email sales to get it, but that's like one of your best options. These are some other options. And if you have an electronic health record like Simple Practice or Therapy Notes, they both have telehealth options within them. I've used both of them. I think they're equally as good. Simple Practice sends out an email with a link that they have to click in every time, whereas Therapy Notes, you have to log into a portal. Um, so, and I actually have Zoom as a backup. All right, that's it on telehealth. I hope you now know all the rules and are able to do great telehealth with your clients. Take care. Thanks. Bye.